Anthony Holland was Hollywood's master of nervous energy, the man who made audiences laugh in All That Jazz and The Lonely Lady. But in 1988, his anxiety wasn't an act. It was a reaction to a death sentence. Diagnosed with AIDS at the height of the epidemic's terror, he refused to let the disease destroy his dignity. Terrified of the suffering to come, he chose to write his own tragic ending. Anthony Holland was born in 1928, a year that placed him squarely in the generation that would be molded by the Great Depression and hardened by the Second World War. However, unlike many of his contemporaries who sought escape in the fantasy of cinema, Holland was forged in the fires of academia. He grew up in the orbit of the University of Chicago, an institution that, in the mid-20th century, was less a school and more of a radical experiment in higher thinking. Under the guidance of Robert Maynard Hutchins, the university had become a sanctuary for the great book's philosophy. It was a place where students weren't just taught to memorize facts. They were trained to deconstruct Western civilization, to question the nature of reality, ethics, and governance. This was the air Anthony Holland breathed. He didn't come to the stage with the vanity of a beauty queen or the desperate need for validation that drives so many performers. He came with the mind of a sociologist. For the young Holland, the world was a series of systems, social, political, emotional, and most of them were absurd. This academic background is crucial to understanding his later acting style. Holland never played a character by simply feeling the emotion. He dissected the role. He understood the character's function in the sociological hierarchy of the script. When you watch his early work, you are watching a man who is thinking faster than everyone else in the room. He possessed a forensic ability to spot the lie in a human interaction, a skill that would serve him well in the theater, but would eventually make his personal life in the closeted world of the 1950s and 60s an exhausting exercise in self-awareness. History often forgets that the comedy boom of the late 20th century, the lineage that gave us Saturday Night Live and nearly every modern sitcom, started in a few smoke-filled rooms in Chicago, and Anthony Holland was there at ground zero. He was one of the original members of the Second City, the legendary comedy troupe that emerged from the Compass Players. But to call what they did comedy is somewhat misleading, at least by modern standards. In the late 1950s, American humor was largely defined by safe, set-up punchline gags, mother-in-law jokes, and slapstick. Holland and his cohorts, including future titans like Mike Nichols, Elaine May, and Alan Arkin, were doing something entirely different. They were performing improvisational social satire. They took the headlines of the day, the anxieties of the Cold War, the hypocrisies of the suburban middle class, and the intellectual pretensions of the elite, and they improvised scenes that exposed the absurdity of it all. This environment was the perfect training ground for Holland. Improv requires a specific type of bravery. You step onto a stage with no script, no net, and you have to build a reality out of thin air. It demands that you listen to your partner with an intensity that borders on obsession. If you miss a beat, the scene dies. Holland thrived here. He wasn't the loud physical clown. He was the cerebral wit. He was the master of the dry, cutting remark that would deflate a scene's tension and reveal the truth. He learned here that humor wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about making them think, often comfortably. He used comedy as a scalpel. However, this period also solidified a certain detachment in his personality. To be a great satirist, you have to stand slightly apart from the crowd. You have to be the observer, not the participant. Holland began to cultivate the persona that would define his career, the outsider looking in, the man who sees the game as rigged but plays along anyway. While Chicago gave him his wit, New York gave him his method. As Holland transitioned from the raw energy of improv to the disciplined world of professional theater, he fell under the influence of Lee Strasberg and the Actors Studio. The method is often caricatured today as actors refusing to break character or doing dangerous things for a role. But for Holland, Strasberg's teachings offered something else: control. Strasberg taught that emotion could be recalled, managed, and deployed with the precision of a surgical instrument. For a man like Holland, a gay man living in an era where his natural desires were criminalized and pathologized, the idea of emotional memory and controlling one's affect was not just an acting technique, it was a survival mechanism. He learned to compartmentalize. He learned that what you show the world is a choice, a construction. This training stripped away any trace of the ham actor. Holland became a character actor in the truest sense. In the hierarchy of Hollywood and Broadway, the leading man is the fantasy, the hero we want to be. The character actor is the reality, the person we actually are. Holland accepted this mantle with a quiet dignity. He knew he wasn't going to be the romantic lead. He wasn't the cowboy riding off into the sunset. He was the clerk, the manager, the neurotic friend, the intellectual. He brought a terrifying competence to these roles. He didn't just play a scene, he inhabited the anxiety of the character, but this professional success masked a growing internal chasm. The more he understood the mechanics of human behavior, the more he saw the cracks in the society around him. By the late 1960s, Holland was an established, respected professional. The United States was tearing itself apart with the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the sexual revolution. But Holland's career was on a steady upward trajectory. He was dependable. Directors loved him because he required very little direction. He arrived on set with the character fully realized, his choices made, his lines memorized, with the precision of an academic citing a source. But intelligence is a double-edged sword. A less perceptive man might have been happy with the steady paychecks and the applause. A less sensitive man might have been able to ignore the casual homophobia of the industry, the way faggot was tossed around writers' rooms like a punctuation mark. Holland could not ignore it. He saw the machinery of Hollywood for what it was, a dream factory run by conservative businessmen who peddled morality tales while living lives of excess. He saw the hypocrisy of the liberal arts community that celebrated freedom on stage, but enforced strict gender norms in private. His comedy background had trained him to spot the fake, and now he was living in the capital of fakery. This dissonance began to create a pressure cooker within him. He was a man who valued truth above all else. His Chicago education demanded it. Yet his career required him to participate in a grand illusion, and his personal life required him to live a lie. As the 1960s drew to a close, Anthony Holland stood at a precipice. He was about to enter the most fruitful period of his artistic life. The new Hollywood of the 1970s, a dirty, raw, cynical cinema, was rising, and it was perfectly suited to his talents. The clean-cut heroes of the 50s were out. The neurotic, complex anti-heroes were in. It was Holland's time. But the personal cost was mounting. The glass closet was being constructed around him. It was a transparent prison. Everyone could see in, everyone knew who he was, but as long as he didn't touch the walls, as long as he didn't try to break the glass and speak the truth aloud, he was safe. He was entering his 40s, a dangerous age for an actor, and an even more dangerous age for a gay man in a youth-obsessed culture. The foundation was laid, the intellect was sharpened, the mask was perfected. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, The tectonic plates of American culture shifted violently, and nowhere was this earthquake felt more acutely than in the cinema. The polished, technicolor dreamscapes of the studio system were collapsing. In their place rose New Hollywood, a cinema of grit, paranoia, moral ambiguity, and relentless realism. Audiences no longer wanted the sanitized hero. They wanted the truth, no matter how ugly. It was in this chaotic, fertile landscape that Anthony Holland found his true medium. If the leading men of the era, Pacino, Hoffman, De Niro, represented the explosive, volatile ID of the American male, Holland represented the superego. He was the neurotic intellect trying, and often failing, to keep the world from falling apart. He became the quintessential New York actor. In the industry, this distinction mattered. A Hollywood actor was tanned, capped teeth, and vaguely athletic. A New York actor was pale, intense, hyperverbal, and carried the weight of the city's concrete on their shoulders. Holland was the embodiment of the latter. His face, with its sharp features and watchful eyes, was a map of urban anxiety. Directors like Alan J. Pakula and Bob Fosse didn't cast Holland to be the hero. They cast him to be the texture of reality. When he walked into a frame in a movie like Clute, the audience immediately understood the stakes. He brought a specific kind of nervous energy, the energy of a man who knows too much, who has read the files, who sees the disaster coming but is powerless to stop it. This was the era of the conspiracy thriller, and Holland was the perfect face for an age of suspicion. However, while his professional stock was rising, his personal life was being hermetically sealed into what cultural historians now refer to as the glass closet. The glass closet is a terrifying architectural concept of the soul. Unlike the traditional closet, where a person is completely hidden and invisible, the glass closet is transparent. Everyone on the outside can see in. They know you are there. They know who you are. But a silent, unbreakable contract exists. You must never open the door. You must never speak through the glass. As long as you mime the actions of a normal heterosexual man, or at least an asexual bachelor committed to his craft, you are allowed to exist. The moment you speak the truth, the glass shatters, and with it, your livelihood. For Holland, this was not a theoretical concept. It was his daily reality. By the early 1970s, in the theater districts of New York and the backlots of Los Angeles, it was an open secret that Anthony Holland was gay. He did not parade false girlfriends around for the paparazzi. He didn't invent stories about tragic lost loves. He simply existed in a state of carefully curated ambiguity. This required a level of constant low-grade performance that was far more exhausting than any role he played on stage. Every interview was a minefield. Every casual conversation with a producer was a chess match where he had to protect his king. He had to be charming but not flirtatious, witty but not camp, intellectual but not soft. He had to project a masculinity that was non-threatening yet credible. To the studio executives, Holland was a safe bet. He was a character actor, which in the coded language of Hollywood meant he wasn't selling sex appeal to women. So his private life mattered less than a leading man's, but the threat was always there. The morality clauses in contracts were still real. The fear that a scandal could taint a production was palpable. Holland was allowed to work, but he was on a permanent probation. In 1971, Holland appeared in Clute, directed by Alan J. Pakula. The film is a masterpiece of paranoia, starring Jane Fonda as a high-end call girl and Donald Sutherland as the detective trying to save her. Holland's role was small but pivotal, a masterclass in the economy of acting. In Clute, Holland plays the agent/manager type. In a film about the commodification of bodies, and the coldness of the city, Holland's performance is chilly, efficient, and detached. He used his Chicago-trained intellect to strip the character of unnecessary sentiment. He played the role as a man who facilitates the system. This role solidified his reputation. He was the guy you hired when you needed intelligence on screen. But there is a cruel irony here. In Clute, the characters are trapped in a surveillance state. Phones are tapped, people are watched, secrets are currency. Holland was living this reality. He knew what it felt like to be watched, to self-censor, to wonder who knew what about his private movements. The paranoia on screen was fiction. The paranoia in his life was fact. If Midtown Manhattan and the movie sets were his prison, Greenwich Village was his yard time. The 1970s in New York City was a mythical era for the gay community. Following the Stonewall riots of 1969, a dam had broken. A culture that had been forced underground for centuries suddenly exploded onto the streets. The village became a sovereign state of sexual liberation. For a man like Holland, uptight, intellectual, controlled, the village offered a chaotic release. This was the era of the clone, the hyper-masculine aesthetic of denim, flannel, work boots, and mustaches. It was a reaction against the effeminate stereotypes of the past. Gay men were reclaiming their masculinity, sometimes performing a caricature of it. Holland moved through this world as a participant, yet also as an observer. He frequented the bars, the clubs, and the bathhouses that became the town squares of this new civilization. Places like the Anvil or the Mine Shaft weren't just about sex. They were about community. They were the only places on earth where the glass walls came down. But accounts from friends and contemporaries suggest that Holland remained somewhat detached, even here. He wasn't the hedonist losing himself in the disco haze. He was the man at the end of the bar smoking a cigarette, watching the dance floor with a wry smile. The intellect never fully turned off. He saw the desperation in the liberation. He saw the frantic need for connection in men who had been told their whole lives that they were unlovable. He engaged in the rituals of the time, the anonymous encounters, the fleeting romances. But for a man of his sensitivity, this fast food style of intimacy must have left a hollow aftertaste. He was a man capable of profound depth, yet the structure of his life forced his romantic world into the shadows, into the brief, wordless encounters of the night. He could not have a husband to bring to the premiere. He could not build a domestic life. He was a master of the theater, but his own home was an empty set. The apotheosis of Holland's 1970s career came at the very end of the decade, with Bob Fosse's All That Jazz. If ever a film captured the psyche of its era, this was it. It was a semi-autobiographical, hallucinatory fever dream about a director working himself to death. Holland played Bob Fosse's fictionalized collaborator, the composer/writer. It was a role of significant weight. He was the sounding board, the cynical voice of reason amidst the madness of show business. The chemistry between Scheider and Holland was electric because it was grounded in a shared weariness. In the film, they are men who have given everything to the biz. They are cynical, medicated, exhausted, and yet they cannot stop. There is a specific scene in the film where the characters are rewriting a show, agonizing over every note, every step. Holland's performance is manic and brilliant. He captures the specific neurosis of the creative class, the terror that the work isn't good enough, that the audience will laugh, that the money will run out. But watching All That Jazz today, knowing Holland's fate, is a haunting experience. The film is obsessed with death. It features a character literally named Angelique, who is the angel of death. The protagonist is coughing, smoking, popping pills, racing toward his own mortality. Holland was playing a man watching his friend destroy himself. In less than a decade, Holland would be the one disintegrating, and there would be no cameras to capture the tragedy. All That Jazz was a premonition. It was a film about the physical cost of the artistic life, about how the industry consumes its creators. Holland stood in the center of that narrative, embodying the loyal soldier who stays on the sinking ship until the very end. By 1979, the strain of this double life had begun to calcify. Anthony Holland was a success by any metric. He was in hit movies, he was respected on Broadway, he was financially stable. But he was a man cut in half. On one side was the public Holland, the dry wit, the reliable professional, the asexual intellectual, the guest who always left the party early. On the other side was the private Holland, the gay man navigating a sexual revolution that was frantic and intense, the lonely soul seeking intimacy in a world that only offered sensation. He had mastered the art of bifurcation. He could switch codes instantly. He could talk to a producer about box office receipts in the afternoon and navigate the unspoken codes of a Christopher Street bar at night. But the human soul is not designed to be partitioned forever. The walls between the compartments were thinning. The tragedy of the character actor is that they are hired to be other people, never themselves. The leading man gets to sell his personality. The character actor must suppress his. Holland had spent 20 years suppressing his true self to service the scripts of others. He had become a vessel for other people's words, other people's emotions. As the decade closed, the atmosphere in New York began to change. The wild, careless freedom of the 70s was darkening. A strange malaise was settling over the community. People were getting sick with winter colds that wouldn't go away. The purple lesions were starting to appear on skin in the bathhouses. Holland, ever the observer, likely sensed the shift in the wind. He had survived the glass closet. He had survived the pressure of Hollywood. He had built a fortress of intellect and irony to protect his soft, beating heart. But he and the rest of the world were completely unprepared for the biological storm that was gathering on the horizon. The 1980s were coming, and they would bring a darkness that no amount of wit, improv training, or method acting could hold back. The curtain was coming down on the party, and the long, silent wake was about to begin. The 1980s did not arrive in New York City with a fanfare of optimism. They arrived with a creeping, cold malaise. If the 1970s had been a decade of noise, the disco thump, the punk scream, the protest chant, the early 1980s were defined by a sudden, terrifying silence that began to spread through the very neighborhoods Anthony Holland called home. For Holland, now in his early 50s, the turn of the decade was supposed to be a time of reaping rewards. He was an established veteran. He had survived the cutthroat nature of the industry and the rigorous demands of the stage. He had his small apartment, his circle of intellectual friends, and a steady stream of work. He appeared in films like The Lonely Guy, alongside Steve Martin, playing exactly the kind of role he had perfected, the dry, slightly weary observer of human folly. But off camera, the script was changing into a horror story that no amount of improvisational training could prepare him for. It began with whispers. In the dressing rooms of off-Broadway theaters, in the dimly lit corners of the West Village bars, and in the casting offices of Midtown, the rumors started circulating. Men, young, healthy, vibrant men, were getting sick. It wasn't the flu. It wasn't something you could sleep off. It was a wasting away. It was a junkie pneumonia, striking men who had never touched a needle. It was a rare cancer that bloomed across the skin in violet, bruised flowers. Holland, with his sociologist's eye, watched the patterns emerge. He saw the empty chairs at the local diners. He noticed the sudden disappearances of regulars at the bathhouses. The phone calls stopped coming. The jovial, hedonistic energy of the village was being replaced by a palpable, low-frequency dread. Historians often cite July 3rd, 1981, the day the New York Times published the headline, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals," as the beginning. But for Holland and his community, the timeline was more personal and far more brutal. For a man living in the glass closet, this new threat was a nightmare on two fronts. First, there was the biological terror, the fear of a mysterious, painful, and inevitably fatal disease. But secondly, and perhaps more paralyzing for a public figure, was the reputational terror. To catch this gay plague was to be outed in the most horrific way possible. It was a scarlet letter stamped not on your clothes, but on your skin. For an actor like Holland, whose career depended on that delicate balance of neutrality of being the safe bachelor, the disease was a career-ending accusation. This created a culture of extreme denial and euphemism. Holland attended funerals, dozens of them, then scores. In the early 80s, obituary pages in New York newspapers became works of fiction. Men died of pneumonia. They died of heart failure at 28. They died of long illnesses. Holland became a silent pallbearer. He stood by gravesides dressed in his somber dark suits, shaking hands with devastatingly confused parents who had flown in from the Midwest, parents who didn't know their son was gay or who refused to believe it. He had to perform the role of the concerned colleague, masking the profound, gut-wrenching grief of a lover or a brother in arms. He could not scream. He could not rage. To mourn too loudly was to implicate oneself. This repression took a massive psychological toll. Imagine the sheer caloric energy required to suppress grief while terrified for your own life. Holland was a master of control. Strasbourg had taught him well, but the human vessel has limits. He was watching his world incinerate, and he was forced to act as if it were just a rainy day. By 1983 and 1984, the trickle of deaths had become a deluge. The artistic community of New York was being decimated. Set designers, costumers, directors, chorus boys, entire creative ecosystems were vanishing. Holland began to suffer from a profound case of survivor's guilt. This is a psychological condition often observed in war veterans or plane crash survivors. But in the context of the AIDS crisis, it had a unique flavor. Why was he, a man in his 50s, who had lived a full life still standing, while 22-year-old geniuses were withering away in hospital beds? There is no record of Holland turning to religion during this time. His mind was too analytical for that. He didn't see the hand of a vengeful God. He saw the cruel indifference of nature. He saw a virus that exploited the very thing that made us human, our desire for connection. He watched the way society turned its back. He saw the Reagan administration's silence. He saw the fear in the eyes of makeup artists who didn't want to touch his face until they were sure he didn't have it. He saw the way people recoiled if someone coughed in a rehearsal room. For a man who had spent his life analyzing social structures, the breakdown of empathy was perhaps more painful than the disease itself. He saw the moral majority cheering on the virus. He saw the hospitals leaving trays of food outside the doors of dying men because the nurses were too scared to enter. Holland, the cynic, found his cynicism justified in the bleakest way possible. The world was indeed as cruel and hypocritical as he had always suspected. Despite the carnage around him, Holland continued to work. In fact, work became a sanctuary, a place where the rules were still clear, where the script still had an ending, where chaos could be controlled. Watch his performance in 1984's The Lonely Guy closely. He is thinner. The eyes are more sunken. He is playing a man isolated by social awkwardness, while in reality he was a man being isolated by a biological siege. He had to maintain the high-functioning mask. In Hollywood, you are only as good as your last medical exam. If rumors started that Holland was sick, the insurance companies would pull his bond and he would be uncastable. So he had to perform vitality. He had to walk briskly. He had to joke loudly. He had to eat heartily in public, even if his stomach was churning with anxiety or the early stages of illness. This performance was the greatest acting challenge of his life. It wasn't method acting, it was survival acting. He was tricking the world into believing he had a future, even as he began to suspect he did not. The exact date of Anthony Holland's diagnosis is lost to the privacy of medical records, but the timeline suggests it occurred around 1986 or early 1987. The moment the doctor walked into the room, the glass closet shattered. It didn't matter anymore who knew or who didn't. The virus knew. In 1986, an HIV diagnosis was categorically different from what it is today. Today it is a chronic, manageable condition. In 1986, it was a death sentence. There were no cocktails, no protease inhibitors. There was only AZT, a drug that was often as toxic as the disease itself, offering only a brief, nauseating reprieve before the inevitable decline. Holland, with his fierce intellect, would not have been satisfied with vague assurances. He would have researched. He would have known exactly what was coming. And what was coming was a dismantling of the self. He knew the stages. First, the fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep could not touch. Then, the opportunistic infections. Pneumocystis pneumonia that filled the lungs with foam, toxoplasmosis that attacked the brain, cryptosporidium that destroyed the digestive tract. And then there was the visual horror, Kaposi's sarcoma, the purple lesions. For an actor whose face is his instrument, this was the ultimate violation. The virus would take his identity before it took his life. However, for Anthony Holland, the University of Chicago intellectual, the founding member of Second City, the man who lived by his wits, there was a fate far more terrifying than physical pain. AIDS, dementia complex. The virus could cross the blood-brain barrier. It could attack the central nervous system. Holland had likely visited friends in the wards of St. Vincent's Hospital and seen the results. He had seen brilliant playwrights reduced to babbling infants. He had seen sharp-witted directors staring blankly at walls, unable to recognize their own families. To lose his mind? To lose the ability to analyze, to joke, to understand, that was not death, that was erased. That was the destruction of the I that was Anthony Holland. He was a man who prided himself on control. He controlled the stage. He controlled the scene. He controlled his emotions. The idea of becoming a prisoner in his own rotting brain, dependent on the pity of nurses, having his diapers changed by strangers. This was an indignity he could not abide. By 1987, the disease began to manifest more aggressively. Holland withdrew. The phone calls were returned less frequently. He began to curate his world, shrinking it down to the essentials. He was living in a New York that had become a necropolis. The music had stopped. The bathhouses were shuttered or transformed. The energetic debates of his youth were replaced by conversations about T-cell counts and funeral arrangements. Holland spent this year in a state of profound contemplation. This wasn't a depression in the clinical sense of sadness. It was a philosophical reckoning. He was weighing the value of suffering. He looked at the trajectory of his friends who had fought to the bitter end. He saw the nobility in their struggle, certainly, but he also saw the agony. He saw the tubes, the respirators, the wasted bodies weighing 80 pounds. He asked himself a question that few dare to voice. What is the point of enduring pain if the outcome is guaranteed? Society tells us to fight. The Hollywood narrative is one of the brave battler. But Holland was allergic to cliches. He didn't want to be a brave battler in a war that was already lost. He wanted to be the director of his final scene. He began to view his life not as a continuous stream that would simply dry up, but as a narrative that needed a definitive conclusion. He didn't want to fade out. He wanted to cut to black. He started to gather his resources. In the underground network of AIDS patients, information was currency. People shared names of sympathetic doctors. They shared hoarded pills. They whispered about the Hemlock Society and the right mixtures to ensure a peaceful exit. Holland, ever the researcher, surely approached this with the same meticulous attention. To detail he applied to a script. He was studying for his final role. As 1987 turned into 1988, Holland was increasingly alone. This was partly by circumstance. So many friends were dead, and partly by choice. He did not want to be seen as a victim. He did not want the pitying glances. He sat in his apartment, surrounded by his books, the artifacts of a life spent in the pursuit of art and truth. He thought about the Chicago days, the freezing wind off the lake, the thrill of creating comedy from nothing. He thought about the applause. He thought about the secrets he had kept. The glass closet was now a tomb, but in a strange twist of irony, it also offered him privacy. Because he wasn't a megastar with paparazzi camped on his lawn, he could plan his exit in peace. He could orchestrate his death without interference. He realized that the only power he had left, the only way to defeat the virus, was to deny it the satisfaction of killing him. The virus wanted a slow, torturous conquest. Holland decided to deny it the battlefield. The stage was set. The script was written. The props, the pills, the quiet room, the summer day were prepared. Anthony Holland was about to perform his final act of improvisation, a response to the ultimate heckler, death itself. By January 1988, the AIDS crisis had shifted from a sudden panic into a grinding, industrialized war of attrition. The shock was gone, replaced by a dull, aching inevitability. For Holland, now 59 years old, the abstract concept of mortality had become a physical roommate. He was entering the final phase of his life, a period defined not by the dramatic arcs of the theater, but by the tedious, humiliating logistics of physical decline. The virus was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was an occupying force. This period of Holland's life is the hardest to document because it was the most silent. There were no film crews. There were no interviews. He was retreating into the fortress of his own mind. But we can reconstruct these final months by understanding the medical and social reality of a man with full-blown AIDS in New York City in early 1988. It was a specific kind of hell, characterized by the slow stripping away of autonomy. To understand Holland's mindset in these months, one must understand the failure of hope. A year earlier in 1987, the FDA had approved AZT, the first antiretroviral drug. For a brief shining moment, there was euphoria. It was hailed as the Lazarus drug. But by early 1988, the grim reality of AZT was becoming clear to patients on the ground. It was not a cure. For many, it was a poison. The dosages prescribed in those early days were incredibly high, leading to severe toxicity. It caused anemia, nausea that made eating impossible, and muscle wasting. It ravaged the bone marrow. Holland, a man who had spent his life tuning his body as an instrument for performance, was likely facing a cruel paradox. The medicine keeping him alive was simultaneously destroying his quality of life. He was an intellectual. He would have read the reports. He would have seen his friends taking the blue and white capsules, checking their watches every 4 hours only to wither away regardless. He realized that science was not going to save him. The cavalry wasn't coming. The realization was cold and absolute. There is no third act twist. This clarity was essential to what he did next. He stopped waiting for a miracle and started planning for a conclusion. Despite the internal devastation, the external performance had to continue. This is the acting of wellness, a specific type of performance art practiced by thousands of gay men in the 1980s. Holland had to venture out. He had to buy groceries. He had to pick up prescriptions. In 1988, you couldn't just look sick in public without consequences. If you looked too thin, people stepped away from you in the checkout line. If you had a lesion on your neck, cab drivers wouldn't stop for you. So, Holland applied his craft one last time. He utilized the sense memory techniques he learned from Lee Strasberg. He remembered what it felt like to walk with energy, to hold his head high, to breathe without a rattle in his chest. He projected that memory onto his failing body. He likely used makeup to cover any blemishes, stage makeup, applied with the same professional care he used for Clute or all that jazz. He dressed in layers to hide the weight loss. He wore scarves to hide the neck, but this performance was exhausting. Every hour spent in public drained his battery for days. The disconnect between the character he was playing, Anthony Holland, eccentric but healthy actor, and the reality, Anthony Holland, dying man, became a chasm he could no longer bridge. He was tired of lying. He was tired of the heaviness of the mask. As the spring of 1988 arrived, Holland moved from contemplation to execution. The philosophical debate in his mind was over. What remained was a logistical challenge. In an era without the internet, acquiring the means for a peaceful exit required navigating a delicate underground whisper network. Holland approached this task with the discipline of a production manager, securing props for a final show. He gathered the necessary barbiturates pill by pill, bottle by bottle, utilizing sympathetic doctors and quiet exchanges within the community. It was a slow, deliberate accumulation of an arsenal. To anyone else, the growing collection on his shelf might have looked frightening. To Holland, it looked like autonomy. These bottles were his insurance policy against the torture chamber of the hospital ward, a guarantee that he would not vanish into the indignity of total incapacitation. Imagine him in his apartment, looking at a growing stash of medication. To anyone else, those bottles might look frightening. To Holland, they likely looked like freedom. They were his insurance policy against the torture chamber of the hospital ward. They were his guarantee that he would never be found lying in his own waste, unrecognizable to himself. Why did he do it alone? This is a question that haunts his narrative. Holland was not a hermit, but he was a man of intense privacy. In the hierarchy of Hollywood, he was a character actor, a journeyman. He didn't have the entourage of a star. He didn't have the massive support system that surrounds a celebrity. Furthermore, the stigma of AIDS had severed many social ties. Casual friends stopped calling. Professional contacts lost his number. The social calendar, once full of auditions and dinner parties, was now blank, but there was also a protective element to his isolation. Holland knew that if he involved anyone else in his plan, he put them at legal risk. Assisted suicide was a felony. If he asked a friend to sit with him, to hold his hand while he drifted off, that friend could be charged with manslaughter. So he chose to protect the few people he had left by excluding them. He decided to bear the burden of the act entirely alone. It was a final act of generosity, wrapped in a layer of cold stoicism. He would be the writer, director, and sole performer of this final scene. As June 1988 approached, the heat in New York City began to rise. The humidity of the city can be oppressive, trapping smells and noise in the concrete canyons. For a sick man, the heat is an enemy. It saps strength. It breeds bacteria. Holland's apartment likely became his entire world. He was surrounded by the artifacts of his life: scripts, books, playbills, perhaps a photo of the old days. At Second City with Mike Nichols and Elaine May, he was looking at these objects and realizing they belonged to a different person. The Anthony Holland who made people laugh in Chicago was gone. The Anthony Holland who traded barbs with Roy Scheider was gone. All that remained was a biological entity fighting a losing war. He began to settle his affairs. This is the unglamorous part of suicide that movies rarely show. He had to make sure his rent was paid up. He had to organize his papers. He didn't want to leave a mess for the landlord or his distant relatives. He wanted to leave a clean slate. He was cleaning house in every sense of the word. He was tidying up his physical space, and he was tidying up his mental space. He was letting go of ambitions. He was letting go of the need for validation. He was letting go of the anger he felt toward the industry that had marginalized him. It is crucial to understand that Holland viewed his impending death not as a defeat, but as a preemptive strike. In military strategy, a preemptive strike is an attack launched to destroy an enemy's ability to attack you. Holland knew the virus was preparing its final assault: the dementia, the blindness, the total incapacitation. He looked at the calendar. He looked at the mirror. He assessed his enemy. And he decided to launch his strike before the enemy could launch its own. He would not wait for the inevitable. He would create the inevitable. This mindset is what separates Holland's death from a tragedy of despair. It transforms it into an act of rebellion. In a society that stripped gay men of their rights, their housing, and their dignity, the only thing Holland owned was his own life. And by taking it, he was reclaiming ownership. He was saying, you can fire me, you can shun me, you can let me die, but you cannot control how I die. By the end of June, the preparations were complete. The pills were counted. The date was loosely set. He waited for a window of time when he knew he wouldn't be interrupted. He was walking a tightrope. He had to be sick enough to know there was no hope, but strong enough to physically carry out the act. If he waited too long, he might become too weak to open the bottles, too confused to swallow the pills. He had to catch the falling knife. The atmosphere in his apartment was likely one of profound stillness. The noise of New York continued outside, the sirens, the shouting, the traffic, but inside, the clock was ticking down. He was about to do the hardest thing a human being can do. The survival instinct is hardwired into our DNA. It screams at us to live, to breathe, to fight for one more second. Holland had to use his intellect to override millions of years of biological programming. He had to use his mind to silence his body's scream for life. He checked the date. July was coming, the height of summer, a time of life, of vacations, of blockbusters. And for Anthony Holland, it would be the time of the final curtain. Saturday, July 9th, 1988. Holland woke up that morning knowing it was the last time he would see the sunlight hit the floorboards. For weeks he had been living in the conditional tense. If I make it to next week, if I feel strong enough. But on this Saturday, the grammar of his life shifted to the imperative. Today was the day. He was 60 years old. He looked older. The virus had been an efficient sculptor, carving away the soft flesh of his face to reveal the skull beneath. But on this specific morning, there was a clarity in his eyes that had been missing for months. It was the clarity of resolve. He wasn't waiting for the disease to dictate the schedule anymore. He had taken the pen back from the writer. Why July 9th? Why that specific Saturday? In the grim calculus of rational suicide, timing is everything. Holland knew he was standing on a precarious ledge. He was sick, but he was still mobile. He could still walk to the kitchen. He could still pour a glass of water. He could still open a child-proof cap on a medicine bottle. He knew that if he waited another week or perhaps even another day, he might cross the invisible line into incapacitation. He had seen it happen to others: the sudden stroke, the onset of dementia, the physical collapse that leaves you bedridden, staring at the ceiling, utterly dependent on the mercy of others to feed or clean you. Holland was terrified of that dependency. For a man who had built his entire identity on intellect and control, the second city improviser who could react to any prompt, the character actor who could anchor any scene, the idea of becoming a passive object of pity was a fate far worse than non-existence. He had to act while he was still the protagonist of his own life. The window was closing. He had to jump through it before it slammed shut. Holland began the preparations. In the theater, every prop has a purpose. Nothing is on stage by accident. On this day, the props were few, but their significance was absolute. He had accumulated the medication over months. It was likely a stash of barbiturates, Seconal or Nembutal, the gold standard, for a peaceful exit in the underground euthanasia networks of the 1980s. These weren't easy to get. You had to hoard them, lie to doctors about insomnia, or trade with other patients. The bottle on his table represented a triumph of logistics. He didn't choose a violent method. He didn't own a gun. He didn't want to jump from a window and traumatize a passerby or leave a broken body on the pavement. That would have been bad form. It would have been melodramatic, and Holland detested melodrama. He wanted a white death, clean, quiet, and internal. He wanted to look like he was sleeping. He wanted the police or the coroner to find a man at rest, not a man in ruin. Even in his final act, he was directing the mise en scène. He was protecting his image. He was ensuring that the final review would acknowledge his dignity. One of the most striking aspects of Holland's death is the lack of a sprawling manifesto. There was no 10-page suicide note blaming Hollywood for its homophobia. There was no tear-stained letter to a secret lover. This silence was a thunderous statement in itself. It was a rejection of the need to explain. Holland understood that the people who loved him would understand why he did it, and the people who didn't love him didn't deserve an explanation. He was done communicating with a world that didn't want to listen. He was done negotiating. A suicide note is often a plea for understanding or a final cry for help. Holland didn't need help, and he didn't seek understanding from a society that had turned its back on his community. He simply wanted to leave. He might have left a simple note regarding practicalities, do not resuscitate, or instructions for his next of kin regarding his estate, but he refused to give the tabloids a tragic final letter to print. He denied them the emotional pornography they craved. As the afternoon wore on, Holland prepared to administer the preemptive strike. This military terminology is appropriate because Holland was in his own way a soldier in a war. The enemy was HIV. The enemy's strategy was to invade, occupy, humiliate, and slowly destroy. The virus wanted to take his mind. It wanted to fill his lungs with fluid. It wanted to cover his skin in lesions. It wanted to make him soil himself. Holland's counter move was radical and decisive by ending his life on his own terms. He was denying the enemy its victory conditions. He was saying, "You can have my body, but you cannot have my suffering. You cannot have my shame." He sat down. Perhaps he poured a drink to help wash down the pills. Alcohol potentiates the effect of barbiturates, a well-known fact in the Hemlock Society handbooks. He wasn't acting out of panic. This wasn't a frantic, weeping moment. It was a transaction. He was trading a few months of agony for an eternity of peace. He was trading the role of victim for the role of decider. He took the pills. It is difficult to imagine the physical sensation of that moment. The survival instinct is the strongest force in nature. Every cell in the human body fights to stay alive. To override that instinct requires a willpower of iron. Holland had spent his life mastering the method. He knew how to control his breathing. He knew how to focus his mind. He likely used those techniques one last time to steady his hand, to swallow the capsules, to suppress the gag reflex. He didn't do it for an audience. There was no director yelling action. There was just a man, alone in a room in New York, swallowing the only cure available to him. After taking the lethal dose, he didn't thrash about. He didn't call 911 in a moment of regret. He went to his bed or his favorite chair. He made himself comfortable. He closed his eyes. He waited for the chemistry to take over. The drugs would have worked relatively quickly. First a heaviness in the limbs, then a fogging of the mind like the dimming of stage lights. The anxiety, the fear of the future, the physical pain in his joints, all of it would have begun to recede, replaced by a warm, narcotic hum. In those final moments of consciousness, Anthony Holland was no longer the character actor. He was no longer the gay man in the glass closet. He was no longer a statistic in the CDC's morbidity reports. He was just Anthony, a boy from Chicago who loved books, a young man who improvised with Mike Nichols, a professional who held his own against Jane Fonda and Roy Scheider. He drifted away. The heartbeat slowed. The breathing became shallow. The frantic noise of 1988 New York faded into a distant buzz and then into nothingness. He didn't die of AIDS. He died of his own will. He died because he chose to close the book before the final, ugly chapter could be written. When the authorities eventually entered the apartment, they found exactly what Holland had intended them to find. There was no blood. There was no violence. It was a tableau of peace. He looked like he was sleeping. The police report would be clinical. Apparent suicide. Overdose. But to those who knew the context, it was a masterpiece of stage management. Holland had spared the first responders the trauma of a gruesome scene. He had spared his landlord the horror of a violent death. And most importantly, he had spared himself the indignity of becoming a medical curiosity. Hollywood's reaction was swift and predictable: silence. The industry that had profited from his talent for decades did not want to discuss the manner of his death. It was too uncomfortable. It brought up too many questions about how the industry treated its gay members. They wanted to say he died of cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. But the truth was far more potent. Holland had fired himself. He had walked off the set. The police report was procedural and dry. To the officers on the scene, this was just another DOA in a city that was seeing thousands of them. In 1988 New York, finding a middle-aged man dead in his apartment was grimly routine. The officers likely noted the pill bottles. They likely noted the lack of struggle. They connected the dots instantly. But what happened next reveals the true tragedy of the glass closet, which remains locked even after death. In a just world, Holland's death would have been a moment of reckoning for the industry that employed him. It would have been a headline screaming about the neglect of gay artists. Instead, the machinery of public relations ground into gear to sanitize the event. If you look for the obituaries of Anthony Holland from July 1988, you will find a study in erasure. The New York Times, the paper of record, ran a brief notice. It mentioned his roles. It mentioned his Chicago roots. It mentioned his survivors. but it danced around the cause of death with the clumsy elegance of a Victorian chaperone. Phrases like died at his home after a brief illness or simply suicide were used. The connection to AIDS was often whispered but rarely printed in bold type. To link his suicide explicitly to the virus would have been to admit that the plague was driving brilliant men to despair. It was too ugly a truth for the breakfast table. This was the final indignity of the era. Even in death, Holland was not allowed to be fully honest. His final protest, the act of taking his own life to escape a ravaged body, was muted by editors and publicists who wanted to keep the legacy clean. They wanted to remember the funny man from The Lonely Guy, not the desperate man with the pill bottle. They stripped his death of its political and medical context, reducing a tragic, defiant act into a mere footnote of personal troubles. Why was Hollywood so silent? Rock Hudson had died 3 years earlier, in 1985, and his death had blown the doors off The Secret. By 1988, AIDS was a known entity. The difference lay in Holland's status and his choice. Rock Hudson was a leading man who fought to live. He was a victim that the public could mourn with simple pity. Holland was a character actor who chose to die. His narrative was infinitely more complex and dangerous. Suicide makes people uncomfortable. It implies a failure of the collective. If a man chooses death over life in your society, it suggests that your society has failed to make life bearable for him. Hollywood, an industry built on the projection of dreams and happiness, had no script for this. Moreover, Holland was a worker bee of the industry. He wasn't the star whose face sold magazines. He was a disposable talent. The studios moved on instantly. There were no tribute specials. There were no moments of silence at the Oscars. The show must go on mentality is brutal. It steps over the bodies of the fallen without breaking stride. Holland, who had served the industry faithfully for 30 years, was erased from its collective memory with terrifying speed. In the years following his death, Holland's story became a quiet, contested parable within the gay community and the medical ethics community. His death sits at the center of the fierce debate regarding rational suicide that defined the darkest years of the plague. On one side were the traditionalists and religious moralists who viewed suicide as a sin of despair, a final act of cowardice. To them, Holland had given up. He had failed to fight the good fight. This perspective was dominant in mainstream America, which demanded that cancer and AIDS patients be warriors until the bitter end. On the other side was a growing underground movement that viewed Holland's choice as an act of supreme courage and agency. This was the era of the Hemlock Society, which argued that terminally ill patients had a fundamental human right to control the timing and manner of their death. For the men in the trenches of the AIDS crisis, the lovers washing bedsheets, the nurses administering morphine, Holland was not a coward. He was a realist. They knew what the end stage of AIDS looked like in 1988. They knew about blindness, dementia, uncontrollable diarrhea, and suffocation. They argued that forcing a man to endure that torture for the sake of morality was the true cruelty. Holland's death forces us to ask, is it brave to endure pointless suffering? Or is it brave to look into the abyss, acknowledge the reality, and step into it on your own terms? Holland decided that his dignity was worth more than a few more months of biological existence. Anthony Holland was not alone. He was part of a ghost platoon, an invisible army of men who checked out early during the 1980s and 90s. Statistics from that era are notoriously unreliable because many suicides were classified as accidental overdoses or heart failure to protect life insurance payouts or family feelings. But anecdotal evidence suggests that hundreds, perhaps thousands of men made the same choice as Holland. They were actors, dancers, writers, and accountants. They were men who had seen their friends die in agony and said, "Not me." They created a secret culture of information sharing. They passed around the book "Let Me Die Before I Wake" like a holy text. They hoarded Seconal. Holland's story is significant because he is one of the few public faces of this hidden history. He represents the men who didn't march in the streets, but who made a radical political statement in the privacy of their bedrooms. Their suicides were a rejection of a medical system that offered no cure and a society that offered no compassion. There is a specific poignancy to Holland's status as a character actor in this narrative. A leading man is a god. A character actor is a mirror. When a god dies, we mourn the loss of a fantasy. When a character actor dies, we mourn the loss of a neighbor. Holland was the face of the everyman. His anxiety on screen was our anxiety. His cynicism was our cynicism. Because he wasn't a superstar, his death didn't spark a telethon or a foundation. It didn't change government policy. It was a small personal tragedy. But in many ways, that makes it more relatable and more heartbreaking. He died as he lived, observing the world, understanding his place in it, and doing his job with minimal fuss. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want to be a spectacle. He simply wanted to be Anthony Holland, dignified to the end. But this humility cost him his legacy. Because he didn't make a scene, history forgot him. While we remember the loud activists and the tragic superstars, we forgot the quiet man who simply turned off the lights and left the room. As the 1990s arrived and the AIDS crisis shifted with the introduction of protease inhibitors in 1996, the cocktail that turned HIV from a death sentence into a manageable condition, Holland's death took on an even more tragic dimension. He missed the lifeboat by 8 years. If he had been born a decade later, or if the drugs had arrived a decade earlier, Anthony Holland might have lived to be 80. He might have played grandfathers in sitcoms. He might have written a memoir. He might have married a husband legally in New York State. This temporal tragedy is the final brutal twist of his story. He was a victim of timing. He was trapped in the worst possible moment in history to be a gay man. His suicide was a rational response to the reality of 1988, but viewed through the lens of history, it is a heartbreaking reminder of the lost potential of an entire generation. He didn't die because he wanted to. He died because 1988 gave him no other viable option.